It's November 1919, and in the Paris suburb of Neuilly, the third peace treaty that would end the war of 1914 to 1918 is about to be signed. The treaty will end the war with Bulgaria and remake the map of the Balkan powder keg, where it all started more than 5 years earlier. But where will the lines be drawn? Hi, I'm Jesse Alexander and welcome to the Great War. Bulgaria had joined the war on the side of the Central Powers in 1915 to recover the territories it had lost to its neighbors in the Second Balkan War. But Bulgaria had been defeated, and now its fate would be determined by the Paris Peace Conference. As with the other treaties, the Treaty of Neuilly-sur-Seine would be named for the Paris suburb in which it was signed. But before we get to the terms of the peace, let's take a look at the situation in Bulgaria and why the new Balkan map ended up being the way it was. Now, back in 1918, Bulgaria had been the first Central Power to ask for an armistice. The country was exhausted and impoverished after 6 years of fighting, from the First Balkan War until September 1918. And though the army had stopped the British attack at Doiran, the French, Serbs and Greeks had broken the line at Dobropolje. At the same time, soldiers angry with wartime hardships rose up in the Radomir Rebellion and marched on the capital, Sofia. The desperate government turned to agrarian socialist politician Alexander Stamboliiski to quell the uprising and calm the men. Stamboliski had been in prison for his anti-war views, but was released. But instead of dispersing the rebellious peasant soldiers, he led them onwards towards Sofia. There, they were defeated by loyalist forces, and Stamboliski fled. The rebellion did, however, lead to the abdication of Tsar Ferdinand, who was replaced by his young son Boris, and the government of Prime Minister Vasil Radislavov also collapsed. The political chaos added to the suffering of the population, in a country now in economic ruin, and which had seen around 90,000 soldiers killed and 39% of the total male population conscripted during the war. The terms of the armistice ordered the evacuation of lands the Bulgarian army had entered during the war, and several port cities were to be occupied by British and French troops, but not by Greeks or Serbs, Bulgaria's Balkan rivals. This was important, since the Bulgarian occupation forces in Serbia had committed atrocities, and the Bulgarians now feared reprisals. Relations between the civilian government of the new Prime Minister, Alexander Malinov, and the army were not good, and the generals later accused the government of not informing them of the full terms of the armistice. The fate of Bulgarian speakers now outside Bulgaria was of utmost concern. Up to 100,000 Bulgarians living in the disputed regions fled into Bulgaria, adding a refugee crisis to the already desperate situation. Malinov tried to organize a plebiscite in the region of South Dobruja, into which the Romanians had moved with French support in November, but this failed, and he resigned. The Tsar then appointed Teodor Teodorov Prime Minister of a coalition government, which managed to survive until the following summer. In August 1919, general elections were held, and Alexander Stamboliski's Socialist Bulgarian National Agrarian Union was the clear winner. Now, given the impending peace settlement, Stamboliski formed a coalition government with the Broad Socialist Party and the People's Party. Teodorov stayed on as Prime Minister, and Stamboliski joined his cabinet. But at the time of the elections, both men were already in Paris, awaiting the terms of the peace. So, Bulgaria had lost the war and plunged into a political crisis awaiting the peace settlement. But before we get to the actual peace terms, let's have a look at what all sides wanted from the coming settlement. The Bulgarians placed their hopes in Wilson's principle of self-determination, given the large Bulgarian populations in the border territories that were now up for grabs. They hoped that the fact that the US and Bulgaria had never formally been at war would help their cause, and they argued Bulgaria was forced into the war by Germany and Austria. The Prime Minister put this message to the Allies. Bulgaria would never have gone into the war if it had realized that it would have come into conflict with England and the great powers. Central to Bulgarian claims were the disputed border regions. They hoped to recover southern Dobruja and retain much of Theiss. They also wanted to keep the old border with Serbia, except, most controversially of all, they also claimed a part of Macedonia, often referred to as Vardar Macedonia. And for today, when I say Macedonia or Macedonians, I mean Vardar Macedonia and its people. Now, in some areas of these regions, Bulgarians were in a majority, but in others, it was harder for the Allied leaders to tell. Bulgaria considered the majority of people in Vardar Macedonia to be Bulgarian, and several prominent officers and politicians were from there. Two of them, Generals Alexandrov and Protogerov, were the de facto heads of the Union of Macedonian Refugee Associations. The UMRA provided support for Macedonian refugees in Bulgaria and also had a strong political stance, favoring the incorporation of Vardar Macedonia into Bulgaria. They wrote the Entente leaders to make their case. The Slav population of Macedonia continues to suffer under the foreign yoke and is subjected to untold privations, humiliations, and cruelties, because it has never ceased to feel itself Bulgarian. Notwithstanding the disastrous end of this war for Bulgaria, the hopes of the Macedonian Bulgarians are yet great that the heavy sacrifices have not been in vain, chiefly because of the happy fact that the conquering powers of the Entente have repeatedly proclaimed that they carried on this war for the liberation of the oppressed nations. So, Bulgarian hopes rested on self-determination to keep the territory that they had previously won and then lost, plus add more of Macedonia and Thrace. But the Allies had a very different approach. Bulgaria's neighbors were keen to keep what they had gained in 1913 and in some cases acquire more territory as well. Romania wanted to keep both northern and southern Dobruja, and the Romanians in Paris skillfully used their importance to the Allies as a bulwark against Bolshevism in Hungary and Russia to press their case. Greece saw an opportunity to expand its territory as part of the Megali Idea of Greater Greece. Some Greeks dreamed of acquiring large territories with ancient Greek connections, but the delegation in Paris focused on Thrace. But it was Yugoslavia that had the most expansive claims. The experienced Serb politician Nikola Pasic led the Yugoslav delegation at the Paris Peace Conference, and he knew Bulgaria well, having spent 6 years there in exile in the 1880s. Yugoslav arguments were based on both strategic and ethnicity claims. They hoped to receive several border districts, up to and including Vidin on the Danube and Strumica in the south. These, they argued, would secure vital railway lines and mountain passes to protect them from future Bulgarian attacks. As for Macedonia, Pasic sent a letter to Clemenceau stating simply that the population there was Serbian. One of his advisors, the geographer Jovan Cvijic, argued more subtly. All impartial educated people in Macedonia, whether they've been raised as Serbs or Bulgarians, know that the Macedonian Slavs do not possess a fixed Serb or Bulgarian nationality. In light of this, we can safely read the chauvinistic authors who wish to prove that Macedonians are purely Serbs, or, on the contrary, pure-blooded Bulgarians. Cvijic also claimed that the people of Vardar Macedonia were closer to Serbia, based on the number of folk songs they had. In fact, the Yugoslavs and Greeks even floated the idea of continuing the war against Bulgaria to achieve their goals, but this was immediately vetoed by Clemenceau. For France, the priority was strengthening Romania and Yugoslavia as a part of a cordon sanitaire to hold back Bolshevism, and in Yugoslavia's case, to keep Italy in check as well. For this reason, they'd allowed Romanian troops to march into southern Dobruja before the peace conference had even begun. As far as Macedonia was concerned, the French decided that it was better not to touch the 1914 border, and this suited their policy of supporting Yugoslavia. On the other hand, the British weren't as firm on the Macedonian question and proposed a special inspector to look into the matter. But when the French objected, they were content to let the question drop. Some Bulgarian historians have explained the French and British attitudes as being the result of Serbian and Greek influence. Italy was sympathetic to the Bulgarian position vis-à-vis Yugoslavia, but only because the Italians and Yugoslavs had become bitter rivals in the Adriatic. The real support for Bulgaria amongst the Allies came from the United States. Before the terms were drawn up, American experts had carried out a study of the region, and its recommendations were relatively favorable for Bulgaria. They dismissed the Yugoslav claims about the ethnicity of the western border districts and recommended that southern Dobruja and much of Thrace be included within Bulgarian borders. This essentially corresponded to the borders after the First Balkan War. As for the thorny Macedonian question, the American experts simply said more study was needed. But the Bulgarian settlement was not a high priority for the US, and by late 1919, the country was slowly beginning to disengage from European affairs. In the end, the French and British positions would carry the day. So, the French and British were determined to strengthen their allies in the Balkans at Bulgaria's expense. With this in mind, let's take a look at the terms as they drew them up. The Bulgarian delegation had arrived in Paris on July 27th after an 8-day train ride, but the treaty was not yet ready. For 10 weeks, they waited in their hotel under police guard while the Allies drafted the terms. And as with the previous treaties, there were to be no face-to-face negotiations. The Bulgarians received the terms on September 19th, which consisted of 296 articles, and they had 25 days to respond in writing. As usual, the Versailles Treaty provided the basis, and the draft had been prepared in haste, resulting in some fascinating clauses being added, such as Bulgaria renouncing all claims to the French Protectorate of Morocco and the British Protectorate of Egypt. In addition, the army was to be reduced to 20,000 men, the Air Force disbanded, and the Navy was to give up its only submarine. Reparations in the amount of 2.25 billion gold francs were to be paid, a higher per capita amount than had been imposed on Germany. The borders were to be drawn as follows. Romania would include northern and southern Dobruja, and western Theiss was placed under the control of the Allies, who had already agreed amongst themselves to award it to Greece, though Greece didn't get quite as much territory as it had claimed. Bulgaria, however, was to retain access to the sea via the free port of Alexandroupolis. Yugoslavia was to receive several small but strategically important areas along the border, but not quite all that they had asked for. Vardar Macedonia, previously in Serbia, would remain in Yugoslavia, and 2 more pockets were added to it as well. A population exchange was also foreseen to correspond with the new borders. 50,000 Bulgarians were to leave Greece, and 40,000 Greeks were to leave Bulgaria. Unlike in the earlier German and later Turkish peace treaties, Bulgarian army atrocities during the occupation of Serbia were not specifically dealt with in the Treaty of Neuilly, and there were no war crimes provisions. Now, as with previous peace treaties, the defeated Central Power, Bulgaria, was shocked about the terms. When the terms became public, a day of mourning was declared across the country, and protesters took to the streets. Many felt that Wilson's 14 points were not being honored, and there was great anger at lands with Bulgarian speakers being lost. A popular saying of the day, revived from the Balkan Wars of the late 19th century, was that Bulgaria would now border itself. The Bulgarian delegation argued for concessions, since Ferdinand had been overthrown and the country was now a democracy, in line with Allied demands. Teodorov gave a defiant speech. "I hope the great people of the victorious states that took it upon themselves to reshape our world give us the resources to rebuild our small nation within its legitimate borders. Handing out lands that hold a predominant Bulgarian population to other nations only carries threats for the future. If Bulgaria must be punished for her sins and her neighbors rewarded, her 400,000 casualties in the last 3 wars are punishment enough. They died to bring freedom to our 1.5 million enslaved brethren in Macedonia and Dobruja." As news spread of the proposed borders, more refugees fled their homes, and many died of exposure in the cold. Eventually, 250,000 refugees left the disputed regions. Teodorov, who himself had previously been elected in a district now in Yugoslavia, refused to sign the treaty and returned to Sofia. He resigned and was replaced by Stamboliiski on October 6th. When the captain of Bulgaria's lone submarine learned his vessel was to be scrapped, he intentionally rammed it into a mine, sinking the vessel and killing himself. Allied reactions were varied. The Yugoslavs now wanted the extradition of Bulgarian generals Alexandrov and Protogerov. Both hailed from Macedonia, and both had fought, along with other Bulgarian officers, for a separatist group that resisted Ottoman and, after 1913, Serbian rule. Now, during the Bulgarian occupation of Serbia during the Great War, thousands of civilians had been killed during a local revolt while the two had been in charge. They may have even ordered the killings. Stamboliiski had both arrested and imprisoned on November 4th. though it's still debated whether he did this under pressure from the Allies or whether he was happy to see the generals, who had defeated his rebellion a year earlier, fall from grace. Now, despite the general dismay in Bulgaria, Stamboliiski ultimately had no choice but to sign, and he did so at Neuilly's Old Town Hall on November 27th. Once he had signed the document, he broke his pen in half in a gesture of revolt. Memorial marches were held in Sofia, and Ivan Vasov, brother of the famous Bulgarian general Vladimir Vasov, spoke to the crowds. "We all need to believe that we will overcome our misfortune and create a new, united and spiritually powerful Bulgaria. Do not despair. The Bulgarian spirit is alive." In Athens, on the other hand, a public holiday was declared, marked by the singing of a Te Deum. So, the peace treaty had been signed and the new borders drawn. But in the immediate aftermath, there were still many open questions with no easy answers. The Allies did attempt to implement the terms with a view to a stable peace, but this proved extremely difficult, and some doubted the new borders could bring stability to the Balkans. Lord Balfour wrote, "It might be assumed that the old frontier in the Dobruja was maintained, though this might be neither equitable nor conducive to peace in the Balkans." For one thing, the reparation scheme soon came in for criticism, since Bulgaria was simply too poor to pay. The totals were lowered and, after just a fraction had been paid, abolished altogether a few years later. A commission including both Yugoslavia and Bulgaria was set up to draw the exact border between them, though this did not address the fundamental Bulgarian claim to Macedonia. As for Theiss, it was not yet officially Greek, but Bulgarian efforts to negotiate with the Greeks failed, and the provision for Bulgarian access to the Aegean was never implemented. Internally, the situation was no easier. Before they could be extradited to Yugoslavia, a group of officers helped Generals Alexandrov and Protogerov escape from prison. They promptly reorganized their old revolutionary organization in Macedonia and began carrying out terror attacks against Yugoslavia and Greece. Other revolutionary organizations were formed by Bulgarians in Theiss and Dobruja as well, and the future seemed pregnant with more violence. The officer class and many others held politicians, especially Stamboliiski, responsible for the country's woes. Prominent writer Stoyan Mihailovsky wrote, "Draw me a brave man, a 2-meter tall, sword-wielding warrior. That is the Bulgarian soldier. Next to him, draw a pathetic little dwarf, a rotten egg, a 2-foot imp. These are the Bulgarian politicians, and that is the story of Bulgaria's recent history." The veteran officers of the military union used the partial victory at Doiran as an example of how Bulgaria wasn't truly defeated, but was instead betrayed by her allies and the home front. Echoing the German stab in the back legend, General Toshev even published a book called Beaten Without Being Defeated. Bulgaria was now politically isolated, and there was strong bitterness with its neighbors. Mihailovsky reflected a continuation of wartime propaganda messages when he wrote, "Hateful enemies, feeding on Bulgaria like vultures, were able to convince the entire universe that we were a stain on human civilization, a tumor in Europe, and that the day of our destruction would be a day of joy and celebration to the purest and brightest amongst the people." Stamboliiski tried to pursue a moderate foreign policy to repair the damage, but this would ultimately fail. The Treaty of Neuilly has become known in Bulgaria as the second national catastrophe after the Second Balkan War. The Bulgarian goal of national unification, dating back to the Balkan Wars of the late 19th century, had failed, and in late 1919, the future looked anything but promising. Poverty, hunger, and sickness stalked the land, especially amongst the 250,000 refugees. Radicalized Macedonians and army officers became politically active, and violent clashes with the Agrarian Union's paramilitary Orange Guard soon became the norm. Stamboliiski needed to re-establish relations with Bulgaria's neighbors to end its isolation, but Macedonian nationalists began to assassinate politicians who called for compromise. And much worse was still to come. So now that we've taken a look at the Treaty of Neuilly, it's time for our Roundup segment, where we have a look at what else is going on in November 1919. On the 1st, American coal miners voted to go on strike for better wages and working hours. The strike lasted until the end of the month and saw 425,000 miners down tools, the use of federal troops, and an agreement to go to arbitration. On the 7th, the US Bureau of Investigation launched one of the largest Palmer raids, targeting suspected Russian socialists. The date was specifically chosen to coincide with the October Revolution 2 years earlier. On the 19th, the US Senate voted against the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles. A separate peace agreement between the US and Germany was only signed in 1921. In eastern Russia, on November 14th, the Red Army took the white capital of Omsk and captured 30,000 demoralized white soldiers who had surrendered without a fight. South of Moscow, on the 17th, the Reds captured Kursk and nearly cut off the main White Army, which continued its desperate retreat towards the Black Sea. From the 4th to the 8th, elections were held in Romania. The Romanian National Party became the largest party under new Prime Minister Alexandru Vaida-Voievod, a Transylvanian. The party's origins lay in the representation for Romanians in the Kingdom of Hungary before 1918. On November 11th, the first Armistice Day was marked with 2 minutes silence at Buckingham Palace in London. On the 14th, the Romanian army withdrew from Budapest, and 2 days later, Admiral Miklos Horthy arrived at the head of the new national army. And finally, also on the 16th, general elections were held in Italy. Niccolò Bombacci's Socialist Party received the most votes, while Benito Mussolini's Revolutionary Fascist Party did so poorly, some predicted his political demise. We want to thank Plamen Ganev for helping us with the research for this episode. And as usual, you can find all our sources in the video description below, including links to our Amazon stores. To get access to all our podcast episodes with expert interviews and other perks, you can also support us on Patreon, or by clicking the join button below. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War 1919, a production of Real Time History and the only YouTube history channel that borders on itself.